ACB logo, ribbon below, 60th anniversary.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks really to the entire ACB team for not only putting on such a wonderful conference, but also really helping advance key issues that policymakers are focused on. I really appreciate it, and I always really value my time with ACB and these conferences. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here today, and I really hope that we can have a good dynamic discussion going forward. So I thought I would walk through really sort of four issues, and then maybe have some questions and answers if that works for everybody. The first will be an overview of the 2022 election and what might happen and some key indicators to continue to monitor. Secondly, I'd pivot to discuss the policy agenda that we should expect for the rest of the year. Third is to discuss a little bit about some tips and advice on being a really strong advocate, and then move into some questions and answers, hopefully. I should start by just giving a little bit of background on myself. I worked on Capitol Hill for about 11 years, a couple years in the Senate and the rest in the House, and then moved into a public affairs firm where I lead the government relations side of the company. And I've been both a consumer and a consumer of lobbying and a producer of lobbying, I guess to say. And so I really appreciate and understand the work that you all are doing, not only with your policymakers in DC, but hopefully with folks back home as well. And I know we're gonna get into that. But first, let me talk about what so many are sort of currently discussing, which is the 2022 election. It may surprise some of us to know that the 2022 election is only 238 days away. In fact, the 2024 election is 966 days away for anybody that's counting. But 238 days away is not a lot of time. I mean, when you think about out of that 238 days, a fraction of those, Congress is in session. And right around this time, you start seeing elections really gear up and hire their staff. And they're obviously in full fundraising mode. In fact, some elections have already had their primaries. So things are really moving in the 22 election year, even though, maybe the onslaught of advertising hasn't started yet. It certainly will very soon. And we're going to start hearing a lot more about what's happening locally on the campaign trail. There's a handful of things that I would call sort of indicators on where this election is going to go. The first is retirements. Right around now and for the couple months preceding, when there's a big election on the horizon, you start seeing a number of retirements, especially in the House side, because members of Congress start observing the realities of the political landscape and start wondering, do I want to hang around if I'm not in the majority? And do I want to go through another difficult campaign cycle? So I always look to retirements as one key indicator early on as to where things are going. And right now in the House, there are 30 Democratic retirements and 18 Republican retirements. That's pretty significant. If you think of 30 Democratic retirements and 18 Republicans, just from retirements alone, there will be 48 new members next year. And in the Senate, there's one Democrat retiring and 6 Republicans retiring. So if you are in the House and you're in the Democratic caucus and you're seeing, you know, a good chunk of your colleagues retiring, there's some immediate concern about what the politics on the ground are what politics are emerging on the ground. So retirements are one indicator. The other is how many seats are up for re-election and how many are at risk. And in the House, all seats are up for re-election. So that's not really a core standard in the House, but there's a good number at risk. And again, Democrats share the majority of that at-risk portion of congressional seats. In the Senate, there are 34 seats up for the 2022 election, and 14 are Democratic and 20 are Republican. And so when observing the 2022 election by numbers alone, obviously Republicans have more to defend in the Senate, and Democrats have more to defend in the House in terms of what's at risk. That being said, we're not necessarily seeing that in trends. Republicans are well positioned in the House, and it's right now sort of going back and forth between Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. So we'll have to pay a little bit more closer attention on that one. So again, retirements, what seats are up for election, also important. And then the third is historical data. And I am a big believer in studying sort of the data behind these elections. And the data tells an interesting story. In fact, since President Truman's midterm election in 1946, only 5 midterm elections have gained seats in either chamber for the president's party. Kennedy gained 3 seats in 62, Nixon gained 2 seats in 1970, Reagan gained 1 seat in 1982, Bush gained 8 seats in the House and 2 seats in the Senate, and Trump gained 2 seats in the Senate. All others lost. In fact, all but President Bush in 2002 lost seats in the House while gaining seats in the Senate. And the average of that loss was pretty significant. When you look at those numbers in more recent history, and I'm not going to bore everybody with just constant data, but just give me 1 more minute here. When you look at those numbers in more recent history, the trends are even more stark for the president's party. Bill Clinton lost 52 House seats and 2 Senate seats. As I mentioned, Bush was a bit of an anomaly and won in both chambers. Obama lost 63 seats in the House and 6 seats in the Senate. And Trump lost 40 seats in the House and won 2 seats in the Senate. Since that President Clinton midterm election, there's been an average loss of 44 seats in the House and 2 seats in the Senate for the president's party. So all that is to say, when looking at historical data, the historical data does not favor Democrats either. And of course, these are pretty odd political times, and voters could prove historical trends wrong, as they did in President Bush's election, where he won in both the House and Senate. But Democrats certainly face an uphill battle against current political trends if you're just looking at history. There's a number of issues that are going to impact the election. And I sort of highlight 6, but there's probably more than that. One, and it's always here, is the economy. Things like gas prices, inflation, jobs, GDP. The economy is always the top issue of how people vote. And I don't anticipate that will be any different. And I also believe, just personally, that people vote the economy on the day that they vote, not what it was 5 months ago, or 4 months ago, or a year ago. They vote how the economy is impacting them when they vote, however they vote. And so the economy is one of those that's sort of a late-breaking issue. Second is national security. And obviously, the emerging situation in Ukraine is concerning. And, voters will consider that. Third, in my thought process is the ability for both sides to sell what I would call policy wins. And that could be passing something, it could be stopping something, but the ability for them to highlight policy wins on the campaign trail. For Democrats, that will certainly be how they sell the infrastructure package as a core win. And that's something that they are certainly out there talking about. Fourth is healthcare, also a constant issue on the campaign trail. Fifth is COVID, even now, sort of what the response to COVID was, what the impact of COVID was, et cetera. And sixth, sort of an emerging issue, is energy independence. And I think there's going to be a lot of discussion around energy independence. I would also say that, redistricting is going to play a role. So it's not just about seats that are up, and it's not just about who's most vulnerable, but a lot of these districts are being shifted around. Some seats are being taken away, some are being added. A lot of those are sort of tied up in the process right now, but redistricting will play a role, and it will certainly provide an opportunity for both parties to shift a little bit and play in some new territory. Again, it's still a long way away to the 2022 election, and we will continue to monitor how that progresses. I think we are probably going to experience some big changes in the House of Representatives. If there is a shift in the majority, just by the way that the House works, everything changes. So all the committees will be run differently. Who determines what's on the floor, how long it's on the floor, what amendments will be passed, will be put in the hands of different people, and the entire agenda will shift. In the Senate, of course, if there was a change in majority, it would shift as well, but to a lesser extent, because they still require 60 votes to pass most things. And so therefore, the Senate would still require strong bipartisan support to move most issues. The House would not. And so it'd be a pretty significant change if those historical trends prove accurate. And I would also say that for the remainder of the time between now and the election, there's a good amount of opportunity for policy wins and losses. And I think I would consider some of that as not necessarily things that reach the president's desk, but also policies that are used for messaging. And I would assume that there will be plenty of that between now and the election. So let me shift to talk a little bit about that policy agenda and what we can expect there. I think there's a handful of issues that will certainly be at the top of this agenda. We continue to focus on COVID, and in fact, as early as this week, there will be an additional spending package that passes that will help address COVID issues. Secondly, for the rest of this month and into next month, the Supreme Court nomination will take a lot of time and focus in the Senate. So we can expect sort of both the vetting process, which is happening now, and the hearing process, which is expected to start later in the month. We can expect a lot of attention will shift to the Supreme Court nomination. I think it goes without saying, just looking at previous ones, this actually does take a lot of time. And while the Senate does move on with business, I think it will be at a little bit of a slower pace when the Supreme Court nominee is moving through the process. There's also a China competition bill that has passed the House and passed the Senate, and sort of behind the scenes they're negotiating it. But this is probably the biggest bipartisan win opportunity left for the year until the election. And so there's a number of policymakers on both sides of the aisle that have really prioritized this and are moving forward. Given sort of the geopolitical landscape right now, I think it probably adds some pressure to pass this bill. But this is, part supply chain, part domestic manufacturing, and part international relations in a sense. And I think both sides are really coming together on this. So that is one that could move. Additionally, the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure bill is something that the administration certainly is taking a lot of time to address. And we are experiencing those implementation dates throughout this year and into next year. And as you may know, that bipartisan infrastructure bill was funded over 5 years. So this is not a near-term bill only, but it's something that getting it moving, if you will take some time. Ukraine response is also a top tier issue, and it's unclear how that will move forward. But they did just pass a spending package that would assist the Department of Defense in some things, and I think Congress is very focused on Ukraine. So as that situation evolves, I think Congress will get more involved. Also, there's a lot of trade and tariff issues related to products that are being imported from China that are scheduled to be considered by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. And that is a really big issue for business and manufacturers. So something that I just list because it will take a lot of attention. The National Defense Authorization Act and what I think will become an end-of-year post-election package is also probably the biggest opportunity for organizations to sort of load up a piece of legislation or two that move towards the end of the year. After the election, when there is no or not as much political vulnerability and political risk out there, people tend to come together and pass an end-of-year package. And unclear what would be in that. That will be funding, policy, combination of both. But that will happen, and sometimes that gets aligned with the Defense Authorization Act, which has to happen before the end of the year. So that is a big opportunity. Just three more things I wanted to mention in this regard. The president's budget is being delivered to Congress at some point next week, we think around the 23rd. And the president's budget is his blueprint on where his priorities will be for the next year. It's never really passed per se. It's just a blueprint. Congress ultimately decides where to spend the money. But it will be an important indication of where the White House is going to prioritize their efforts and their policy positions for the rest of the year. Traditionally, after that budget, the appropriations committees in the House get together and start building these spending packages. And I think because of the election year, that's probably not going to happen. So they just passed a big appropriations bill. I think the next appropriations bill will have to wait a while. And then lastly, are messaging bills. These are bills that are likely not going to be signed into law, probably in some indication don't have any intention of being signed into law, but are really used to provide solid messaging for policymakers to campaign on. And that is a very normal thing before an election, and I think there will be a good amount of that. So before we turn it over to questions, I'm just going to quickly talk about being a really good advocate. And I know from my experience with ACB, there are great advocates, and the work that is being done is just awesome. But a few things that I always want to tell folks, first and foremost, is advocacy should really be an ongoing discussion and not just a one and done. You know, one meeting a year because the conference is around, and then waiting till the next year. When you do that, what happens is the million people that have talked to that policymaker's office in between sort of get a lot more of the attention. So try to keep the conversation going. Keep them updated, the office updated on what you're doing, how the issue's evolving. Manufacture reasons to reach out and ask questions about if they've had a chance to review what you provided them. Also connecting the issues locally. making sure that your members of Congress and senators understand the local and state impact of these issues, or maybe the opportunity costs of them not passing. Connecting with the office in DC where the policy staff is, and also the office back home where the liaisons to constituents are. Both really important and serve really important roles in a congressional office. I only say this because I'm a past staffer, and I am trying to push my own my own position in society, I guess. But I think staffers are as important as members of Congress. They certainly help make a lot of decisions. They are the ones on the ground that are really working these issues. And so if you're meeting with staffers instead of members of Congress, like I really, in a lot of ways, equate the two. And in some sense, because staffers are really the ones doing so much of the work prior to the member of Congress making a decision on what he or she will do, I think it's just so important to get in front of the staff. So if you're meeting with staff, great. If you're meeting with members of Congress, also great. But I just don't want to discount the role that staff are doing. And then lastly, before we move into questions, I just say the work that you're doing is really vital. And I hear a lot of people that feel like they get lost. I'm sorry, that they get lost in the advocacy space, that they're not quite sure if people are actually responding to what they're advocating about. And I can understand why. This year alone in the House and Senate, there were almost 11,000 bills introduced this Congress. And, there's been about 1,100 votes. And most of those votes were procedural. So a very few number of votes on actual bills and amendments. And so I can understand why some people would think that. But the reality is constituents really matter to policymakers. And policymakers can't be experts on every issue. And on some of the issues that you're working on your great agenda, there's a pretty narrow set of experts. And so one of the roles that you have is really educating your policymakers on why these issues matter and what the impact of these issues are to constituents back home. And that's just really important. And so the work that you're doing, I can't overstate how important it is and how impressive it is. So with that, I will turn it back over for questions.
Thank you so much, Charles, for your analysis of the remainder of the 117th Congress, as well as the landscape here in 2022. I have very few questions left from following your presentation, but I know that plenty of our members will. So folks, if you have questions, please email Janet Dickelman at questions@acb.org. And you can also call or text Janet at 651-428-5059. And while we're letting those questions come in, Swatha, do you have any questions for Charles?
When Swatha's done, I do have one already.
All right, that works. So Charles, you mentioned the Supreme Court nomination process, and we've heard a lot about this nominee, Ketanji Brown Jackson, being historic, and President Biden was very focused on nominating a woman of color to the bench, and she has had work on disability issues in the past, especially with regard to Uber and wheelchair access. So I just want to get your thoughts on how her nomination and her confirmation, and once she's confirmed, how it's going to affect kind of our work as advocates and Congress in general, how it's going to affect midterms or landscape?
Great question, Swafa, and thank you very much for asking it. It certainly is an historic nomination the president has made, and I think it's going to be a successful nomination. I think she will certainly, I believe, will get through the confirmation process and in the Senate, and will ultimately be confirmed to the Supreme Court. It takes a little while, and that process is, as we've all experienced in the past, is pretty robust and takes some time. And we will be hearing much more from her and her advocates and the senators between now and then. But certainly the response among senators already has been pretty positive, especially on the Democratic side, which are the ones that have the ability to push over the finish line. So that's sort of how I think the confirmation will go. Of course, I'm sort of an observer here like everybody else, but it seems like this is moving in that direction. In terms of what the impact will be on both the election and your issues, I would almost take a step back from the second part of your question on your issues. I always had a belief that I'd go to law school, and I took the LSAT, and after seeing my score, it ended my dreams of going to law school. But so it's tough for me to be a real good predictor of how the Supreme Court will adjust given her presence on the bench. And that's something that I think, especially as we move forward, we're gonna know a lot more about. But I really don't have a lot of insight there, candidly. So I'm gonna pass on that question. The one that I will talk about is, will this have an impact on the election? And the reality is, Supreme Court picks do have an impact. It's really not the only, but probably the biggest nomination that a president can make that, a lot of people sort of, locally in communities really pay attention to and understand, because they view Supreme Court nominees as really sort of tipping the scales on some issues. And I think that this sort of works both ways. It energizes Democrats to have a new Supreme Court pick, just like it has Republicans in the past when they did. And depending on the vote, obviously Republicans sometimes campaign against that. So hard to tell what the end result will be, but certainly Supreme Court is always, and this will be no exception, be a focus of the 2022 election.
And Charles, one more question related to this topic before Janet offers the audience question. I guess to build off of Swatha's question, is there a level of political capital that'll be used by the administration or by Democrats to confirm this candidate? And does that impact the domestic policy agenda that may move some of our issues forward?
Yeah, so, traditionally I would say yes, but this has been a little bit of a different process, not just with this nominee, but just with everything that's been in Congress. Getting the infrastructure bill over the finish line took a significant amount of political capital. Getting the omnibus package, all 12 appropriations bills, funded took a lot of political capital. I think, coming together around Ukraine to some degree took some political capital. So will this obviously require the president to work it? Absolutely. And the White House is certainly doing that. Is this one that maybe comes with as much controversy as some others have in the past? I don't think so. But again, I'm monitoring it in the same way everybody else is through the news. But I don't think that this is something that will use up all the political capital that exists in the White House. I think the White House is going to spend a lot of that political capital trying to get the COVID package passed, trying to get the China competition bill passed, and potentially a number of other things before the year is over. I think that sort of traditional metric of political capital can only be used a number of times. I think that that's not necessarily accurate anymore, just because of the very bizarre ebbs and flows of policy that we've seen happening over the last several years.
Thank you.
Janet, what's the question got?
All right. Well, apparently a lot of people are interested in the elections, because I have a question from Peter in Wisconsin asking how you feel the findings on the January 6, 2021 commission will or could impact the elections.
That's a great question. And, it goes without saying, as someone who used to work in the Capitol, I've paid a good amount of attention to some of the proceedings there. That is something that is a little hard to determine. I think there's a lot of people focused on the January 6th commission or committee, but I also think that both parties to some degree have been really focused on a lot of other issues, and so will there be certainly findings that will be of interest to voters? I think so. I believe there will be. Will those findings, impact the average election back home? I'm just not sure. That's a tough one to evaluate, especially in a time when there is so much sort of crowded noise in the policy space. But certainly there will be a lot to report there. Certainly there'll be a lot of coverage of it. How it impacts the individual election, I think, is yet to be determined.
And I just got another election-related question from Charles, and he wants to know how you feel the elections are going to be impacted by the constant conversation about the 2020 elections being stolen.
That is a narrative that in some places continues to be present, and it certainly has activated a group of voters significantly that are very focused on that. I think, generally speaking, and I can't speak for the Republican Party, but I think a good portion of the Republican Party has moved on from that and is really focused on trying to put together sort of what the agenda is going forward, and not as much sort of what happened in the last election. So I think with a segment of voters, certainly there will continue to be a focus on some of those issues from 2020. But I generally think that people are looking to other issues to run on.
Thank you. And I have one other question, although I'm not really sure Charles can answer this, but maybe it's more a Clark and Swatha question. But gentleman from Berkeley called me and wanted to know what we can do to help our blind friends, compatriots in the Ukraine and Romania and Poland.
That is an interesting question, and one
Yes.
that I think that our immediate past president, Kim Charlson, and the World Blind Union are probably well situated to assist us with. So I'll be happy to forward that along, Janet.
I will do so. And that is all the questions I have for the moment.
And I'm sure more will be coming in.
Will
Charles,
be popping in.
A couple times you've mentioned now the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. that was passed last year. That's certainly something that our transportation, as well as pedestrian and environmental access committees and members focused on transportation and environmental access issues are paying close attention to, especially with the omnibus now passed and the funding that will flow to the state and local governments. I'm curious, so at the national and the federal level, do you see that impacting the ability to move additional transportation related priorities forward, whether that's something like a national framework for autonomous vehicles or changes to the paratransit system, such as our legislative imperative, the Disability Access to Transportation Act from last year?
I do. I think, knock on wood, transportation remains one of those issues that really does bring supporters from both sides of the aisle that really want to work together. And obviously, it's something that impacts every district in Congress. And it's one that, while at times has become slightly partisan, generally speaking, it has a lot of constructive policymakers that come together to really think through meaningful funding and policy options to make transportation not only better, stronger, but more accessible for people. So I do think there's a little momentum behind transportation policy, and that does always present more opportunity to take that momentum and shift it towards adjacent issues. And so I do think that there is some opportunity to do that. Obviously, the autonomous vehicle legislation or that policy debate has been ongoing and has been close at a number of points, but continues to be sort of a hot topic of discussion among policymakers. I do think there are opportunities to pass these sort of more targeted bills. Whether that comes between now and the election, hard to tell, or whether that could be something that comes after the election when people in Congress are a little bit more willing to add a number of things to the agenda that maybe they hadn't during the year. A little bit unclear. But I do, on a lot of your imperatives, I look at the end of the year as an opportunity to start moving things. And that's for a couple reasons. One is on some of these, it's become increasingly tough to pass standalone bills in the House and Senate, and things are largely being packaged together. And, a lot of that opportunity to be added to one of those packages will probably come towards the end of the year and not prior to the election. But, if everything's about bipartisan support to be able to move now. So if there's enough bipartisan support and both sides come together, Clark, and I know you've been working on these issues with both sides of Congress, timing is less of an issue.
That's great. Thank you. Swatha, any additional questions for Charles?
Yeah. You talked earlier about how there are several thousand bills, or maybe less than that are introduced every year, and that a lot of those don't get passed, don't make it past like a committee or make it out of to a vote. Can you sort of talk about on the impact of the messaging bills? Because I know a lot of people think that if it doesn't pass, it's kind of last the end of the world, I guess. So just the impact of messaging bills and impact of raising awareness of certain issues through legislation.
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, when I was working on Capitol Hill, I always tried to develop strategies to move legislation based on, trying to produce some secret formula around how bills move. And interestingly enough, very unlike, maybe maybe most sectors out there, there really isn't a formula for how these bills move. There's a lot of what I would call inputs, a lot of sort of factors that go into these bills, and some of those drive action and some of those don't. And it's not really, it really depends on the bill. There's not some critical mass or threshold. In some cases, a ton of co-sponsors matter, but there's also cases where there are no co-sponsors and the bill gets signed into law. So it's hard to, I'm going to get your question, but just a note on the process. It's hard to really define what's the perfect process to get a bill moving. And we do know, however, that there's a number of things that really matter. Right now, it's really important to have bipartisan support. It's also really, and if not, it's really important that there's not partisan opposition. We also know that it's really important that bills have a connection to districts and states, so that a member of Congress is not sort of championing an ethereal concept, but something that is real back home for their constituents. I think it's also really important that that bills are constructed in a way that do have some messaging value. And this is getting back to your question, Swatha. The Congress has changed over the last 20 years. And, maybe prior to that, there were a lot more people that were very policy focused. And now you're having a lot more people that are focused on policy, obviously, or they wouldn't have a job, but they're also very messaging focused. And the reason for that is because they know that they can advance issues, not just through the committee process and amendment process in the House and Senate floor, but they can advance issues by elevating them in the public through messaging. So I think the messaging bills are really important. It helps educate people. It helps bring attention to issues. There's a political aspect to it too, which you can't understate, which is, it forces people to vote on an issue and take a position. But messaging bills are used by both sides to elevate priorities, and that's really what they do. So it helps, I would say, move the debate, not necessarily move the bill. And Congress has a platform to do that. But when looking at bills more broadly, it's vital that there's a methodical strategy behind it that leverages organizations like ACB and folks throughout the country that are willing to advocate for it and really educate policymakers on what the bills do and why it's important. I said there's thousands of bills that are introduced. A fraction of those make it to committee, even smaller fraction make it to the Senate or House floor. And, the one thing that the ones that get across the finish line probably all have in common is they have real champions that not just when you're there, but when nobody else is in the room, are really pushing to have these done. And that comes based on great relationships with advocates like all of you and great education from organizations like ACB.